Welcome to the show. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something you might not expect, the concept of ashar in Islam,
Okay.
and how it connects to ideas of unpaid labor and economic justice.
Interesting.
Our main source for this deep dive is going to be scholar Abla Hasan and her book, Decoding the Egalitarianism of the Qur'an.
Yeah, even many Muslims, I find, might not be familiar with this particular interpretation of the Quran.
It's definitely a new way of looking at it, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Hassan argues that the Quran interpreted a certain way advocates for wives being financially compensated for domestic labor.
Interesting.
Kind of challenges some common assumptions,
It
right?
does. It really does. What do you, how does she define that?
That's a great question because it all comes down to this idea of ajar
Okay.
and how it's distinct from ṣidāq.
Right.
So you have ṣidāq, which is the bridal gift,
Yeah.
but ajar is something different.
Right. And so Hassan is arguing that ajars is actually ongoing compensation paid throughout the marriage, and it's linked to the efforts that a wife makes.
So like if you think about it, instead of just a one-time gift, it's like a stay-at-home spouse having a recognized salary,
Yeah.
which is a huge shift.
It is a huge shift.
So how does she actually back this up from the Quran?
Yeah, so she points to specific verses. For example, there's one verse that links ajars to what husbands kind of enjoy in a marriage,
Okay.
which she interprets as referring to like intimacy and by extension, the domestic work that enables like a harmonious marriage.
Interesting.
And then another verse discusses continued ajars payments, but after divorce,
Okay.
but only if the wife is pregnant or nursing.
So even in those situations where you're talking about the dissolution of a marriage, there's this acknowledgement that there's a financial responsibility inside of the marriage.
Exactly. And it's interesting because that is not how those verses are typically interpreted.
No,
Yes.
it's not. It's really making me see this in a whole new light. What do you think, listeners? This idea of ongoing compensation for domestic work, pretty revolutionary, right?
It's a big idea. And, Hassan doesn't shy away from the complexities of it either.
Right.
She acknowledges that, to calculate a jar is not simple.
It's not like you can just slap a number on it.
Right. How do you put a precise monetary value on domestic work?
On keeping a household running,
Yeah.
raising children, all of that.
Yeah, all of that. And it also brings up this question, if it's more than just the husband's obligation, then who else is involved?
Ooh, now you've got me really curious.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that.
Yeah.
Who else could be responsible for ensuring this ajar?
Right. So Hassan suggests that a jar could be a collective responsibility.
Okay.
And she even mentions this idea from the scholar Rachel Ganucci that governments could actually provide this compensation.
Wow, government-funded ajar. Okay, now we're going somewhere.
Right. So the idea being that this would recognize the immense societal benefit of this domestic work. That it's not just about the individual family, but it's about the very fabric of society.
I love that. It really does make you rethink so many things about what has been traditionally viewed as female roles and how we value different types of work.
Absolutely.
What stands out to you listeners about this idea of ajar as a collective responsibility?
It really makes you think outside of the box, right? Like, how do we even put a price tag on something like that? Work that's always been seen as women's work.
Totally. But if we start to see ajar as this societal thing, right, wouldn't that discourage women from having careers?
Yeah.
Like, would it limit their choices?
That's a good point, and Hassan actually addresses that head on. She makes it clear she's not saying ajar is about keeping women at home. She's still all for women going after careers if that's what they want.
So it's not about, like, pushing women back into these traditional roles.
Not at all. It's about being fair and giving options. Hassan believes that if a woman decides to really focus on the household, her work should matter, be valued, both within the marriage and by society as a whole.
So it's about recognizing the choice a lot of women are already making,
Right.
whether it's because they have to or because they want to.
Exactly. It says they have the power to choose what they do with their lives and their work, whether that's at home or somewhere else.
That's so important. It's not about taking choices away. It's about making sure women have more choices. And if they choose to focus on home stuff, they're treated fairly. What do you think is the big takeaway here for our listeners? Is it about fairness for each woman? Or are we talking about a bigger change in society?
That's a deep question for sure. Hassan's work is about Islamic thought, but these questions go way beyond one religion or culture, don't they?
It's so relevant now with all this talk about gender roles and how we decide what work is worth. The pandemic really made these issues impossible to ignore.
Absolutely. It was like everyone had to face the reality of unpaid work and how much falls on women. The lines got blurry between work and home for so many people. It made everyone ask new questions about how we split up work in our families and as a society.
Yeah, it was like everyone got a peek into what a lot of women have been dealing with for years. Do you think this could actually change how we see these issues in the long run?
I think it's definitely something that makes people talk more. Hassan's work is really interesting because it uses religious and academic ideas. It's a fresh way to start these complicated conversations.
It really makes you think.
Yeah.
So, as we kind of wrap up our deep dive on HR, what's the big takeaway you hope people walk away with?
I think for me, it's that a jar isn't just some, abstract idea from religious texts. It could actually change how we see things like work and family and economic justice, even today, you know?
Totally. It's a whole different perspective. But if we take this ajar thing seriously, where does it lead us? Like, what are the bigger implications here?
It's like opening a can of worms in a good way. Imagine how families would change if this financial arrangement was real. Would it shift the power balance in relationships? And what about the economics of it all? It's huge.
Right. Could this change how we see social safety nets, how we do taxes even? Makes you wonder about some really big changes.
Exactly. And what about gender roles? If we start valuing domestic work, could that lead to more equality in other areas of life too?
Wow, it's like a domino effect. Well, listeners, I think it's safe to say this deep dive took us on a journey, from ancient writings to some seriously complex stuff we face today. And it all started with this one powerful concept.
And that's what's so cool about these deep dives, right? It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about asking those tough questions that change how we understand ourselves and the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So here's my challenge to everyone listening. Keep this conversation going. Check out Hassan's work. Talk about it with your friends, family, even your book club. Let's keep these ideas alive and see where they take us. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.